Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We are very thankful to you all for your participation. And for just to remind you, this is a webinar called Key Implications for Small Islands in the Caribbean of the IPCC Working Group 2 report on climate change impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. My name is Vincent Sweeney, and I'm the head of the UNEP Caribbean Sub-Regional Office, and we are based in Kingston, Jamaica. This webinar is organized jointly by the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean of UNEP and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the third in a series of 4 webinars with the main authors of the latest Working Group 2 report. The objective of the series is the dissemination of the key findings of this report, launched on 28th of February, with a focus on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability to climate change. Today, we will have presentations on behalf of 3 lead authors of the report, including Michelle Mikko, Shobha Maharaj, and somebody who will be presenting on behalf of Adele Thomas, with a dialogue followed by questions and answers. The chair of the IPCC, Ho-Sung Lee, has said that, and I quote, "This report is a dire warning about the consequences of inaction," and further quoting, that it shows that climate change is a serious and mounting threat to our well-being and a healthy planet. The report examines the impacts of climate change on nature and people around the globe and explores future impacts at different levels of warming and the resulting risks, and offers options to strengthen nature's and society's resilience. The report presents a specific chapter on small islands due to the special relevance that the impacts of climate change have on them, which threaten water and food security, livelihoods, human settlements, well-being, health, and ecosystems, including biodiversity. To prevent the loss of lives, livelihoods, biodiversity, and infrastructure caused by extreme events such as hurricanes, floods, droughts, or rising sea level, immediate and more ambitious measures are urgently needed to address climate risks while achieving rapid and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the report notes. Progress on adaptation is uneven, and gaps between what is being done and what is needed to address growing risks are widening. We already know that we have a great opportunity with nature-based solutions to reduce the vulnerability of ecosystems and rural and urban human systems. This report also highlights the limits of adaptation, which already exist, and the consequent losses and damages. Urgent action is required to deal with increasing risks. And I'm going to quote again, "Our actions today will shape how people adapt and nature responds to increasing climate risks." And this is another quote by the chair of the IPCC. Climate resilient development implies transformations in political and socioeconomic systems with the participation of all actors, from governments to civil society and the private sector, through pathways that the recent report proposes. We will go deeper into these pathways in our next webinar next week. Ladies and gentlemen, in a post-COVID recovery context, we need to accelerate the access to climate financing aligned with economic recovery, allowing countries to rebuild better with low emission and climate resilient investments, driving economic growth, job creation, and significant environmental and social benefits. We are facing the triple planetary crisis on climate, biodiversity, and pollution. The report that we will present today is built on internationally peer-reviewed scientific literature. We want to stress the importance to have both scientific literature and people from our region participating in these reports. We recommend the public and governments to make use of the information in these reports for the formulation of policies and programs with scientific robustness. In addition to the 18 chapters and 7 chapter papers of the report, there is a technical summary and a summary for policymakers. The latter summary has a political validation with the aim of building a more effective science policy interface. So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give the floor to my colleague, Ismail Syed, Adaptation Specialist from the Climate Change Unit of UNEP's Regional Office. Ismail is based in Cuba, and he will moderate the debate and the following question and answer session. Thank you very much again. Thank you for your patience as we started a little bit late. And thank you for your continued interest in this webinar. I hand over to Ismail, and thank you very much. Over to you, Ismail.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for this comprehensive introduction on what the report showed us and where we are in terms of opportunities and pathways from now. No? And I want to thank everybody again for your presence in this webinar. As Vincent already introduced, we're having a dialogue with three lead authors of the working group's second report. We will have Michelle Mikko. We'll be introducing them as they start speaking. We will have Shobha Maharaj. We will have Debbie Lay instead of Adela Thomas, who was in the agenda. So thank you for the three panelists. I want to start to asking to Michelle Mikko. Michelle, she's a professor of urban and regional planning of the Department of Geomatics and Engineering and Land Management of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. And she's the coordinating lead author of the chapter 15 on small islands of this assessment report of Working Group 2. So thank you very much, Michelle, for your presence here as coordinating lead author. We wanted to ask you to speak about the key findings of the report in the small islands of the Caribbean. We have this chapter on small islands. So we wanted to ask you to focus on the Caribbean and what are these cascading and compounding impacts across both natural and human systems that we've been reading through the report. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Ishmael, and thank you to UNEP for the invitation to present on this webinar. It is a challenge to present in the time that we're given, 4 years of work, but I will certainly attempt to do my best in teasing out what are some of the key findings of the scientific assessment. And with that, I will start and then hand over to my colleague, Shobha Maharaj. So one of the first key points that came out of our assessment is that global warming continues to rise. And with global warming reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term, it will cause unavoidable increases in both multiple climate hazards as well as present multiple risks to ecosystems as well as humans. The level of risk, of course, will depend on a number of concurrent trends: the vulnerability of population in the region, poverty levels, exposure of our geographies and coastal geographies as well, the level of socioeconomic development in the society, as well as the adaptation responses we pursue. What is most significant, I think, is that even if in near-term actions were to be taken to limit global warming, to keeping it within the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that can reduce substantially losses and damages to both our human and natural ecosystems, even such action cannot eliminate all the losses and damages that we can suffer. So this is an extremely instrumental point that has been conveyed in our assessment. The assessment also says that urgent action is needed if 1.5 degrees Celsius is surpassed. And what is instructive is we are saying that the global average temperature is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels in the next 20 years. If that is the case, we have to take deep cuts in our greenhouse gas emissions, and we have a very brief window to rapidly close off that increase in temperature. So we are going to have to take, in other words, urgent action to keep the carbon emissions within the below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And at the rate we're going, we are seeing that it can reach or exceed 1.5 in the next 20 years. So that's the sort of time horizon we're talking about. In looking at impacts and risks, what we noted is that small islands are experiencing human-induced climate change impacts, and the climate risks will continue under the current conditions of global warming. We are seeing from our assessment, small islands are experiencing more and more impacts from increases in temperature, tropical cyclones, storm surges, changes in precipitation patterns, sea level rise. And what the data shows is that among 29 Caribbean small island developing states, 22 were actually affected by at least one category 4 or 5 tropical cyclone in 2017, which is just in the recent times. The impacts on ports, roads, reservoirs, in fact, make rescue operations logistically complex, and it can result in a number of cascading impacts, such as loss of fresh water, food supplies, consequences for public health, including delayed mortality, physical injury, vector-borne diseases, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, that's in terms of what we've been observing, but in terms of impacts and risks, we are also projecting, based on the science, that we are going to see marine and terrestrial ecosystems and the services they provide heavily impacted, which will in turn have cascading impacts across both the natural and the human systems. Most significantly, any changes in wave climate superimposed on sea level rise resulting from the melting of glaciers will increase coastal flooding. And we have already begun to see coastal flooding, but we are going to see an exacerbation of that. And we are going to also see some low coastal and reef island erosion. Now, the frequency, the extent, the duration and consequences of coastal flooding can increase, is what our projection is saying, from around 2050, unless we take coastal and marine ecosystems, we help them to adapt naturally to sea level rise. And the data is showing, or scientific research is showing, that tropical storms will remain the major driver of flooding. So in terms of impacts and risks from climate change, we are already experiencing some of these impacts, and our projections are saying they can worsen within the next 30 years or so, unless we take measures to facilitate nature's way of adapting. And what is instructive is, of course, we know about the tropical cyclones in our region and the flooding that and the damage that causes. I know Shobha will discuss ecosystems and biodiversity, but before I hand over to Shobha, I would like to talk a little bit about the coral reefs. This is part of the coastal and marine ecosystem. And what our report showed was that we are seeing severe coral bleaching in our region and a decline in coral reef abundance. In fact, under future climate scenarios, we are seeing that small islands will in fact experience coral bleaching on an annual basis before 2040. That's not too far into the future. And that if we move beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, this extremely sensitive ecosystem can result in a loss of 70 to 90% of coral building reefs, and maybe even as much as 90% if the global warming moves beyond 2 degrees Celsius and or more. In fact, even if we were to keep the warming transiently, to stop it from exceeding to 1.5 degrees Celsius in the coming decades, the damage, or even later, the damage will definitely be irreversible because of the fragility of these ecosystems. Coming to the human systems aspect of it, human survival in our islands would be highly threatened by climate change, particularly because we anticipate drought and salinization of freshwater resources. What we are seeing is that coastal land loss can be attributed to higher sea level, increased extreme precipitation can cause flooding. We can see wave impacts and increased aridity. All of that will in fact affect agricultural food production and effect, therefore, of food and water security, and which can become very acute in many of our various islands. The data shows drought risk projections for the Caribbean, that anything at 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, somewhere from 1.7 degrees Celsius to 2.7 degrees Celsius could result in a 60% increase in the number of people who will experience severe water resource stress or water shortages from 2043 to 2071. Looking at our settlements, I think we need to pay close attention to our settlements, because we've certainly seen that our coastal cities and rural communities, many of which have a coastal orientation, they've already been impacted by rising sea level, heavy precipitation events, tropical cyclones and storm surges, which in fact cause flooding and other forms of damage. In fact, as of 2017, the data shows that as much as 22 million people in the Caribbean live below 6 meters in elevation. It means that's the area where we have a concentration of people, infrastructure, and economic assets, and that any climate change will have an effect on these settlements, their infrastructure, human health and well-being, our economic security, food security, and even impacts on our culture or way of life. And that especially through the compound effects. So with that, I want to hand over the baton to Shobha. I've covered the generalized points of the assessment. I've looked at some of the critical findings of the scientific literature in terms of food and water security and cities and settlements and the sensitivity of our coastal and marine ecosystems, coral reefs. So I would hand over to Shobha to deal with the ecosystems and biodiversity impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this comprehensive situation of the impacts and risks that we have on the islands in the Caribbean, that everybody who lives here, we can assure that we see impacts, and every year is more noticed. And to make an introduction for Devi, sorry for Shobha Maharaj, she's an independent researcher. Thank you, Shobha, for being here with us. Shobha is lead author of Chapter 15 on Small Islands, and she's also lead author of the cross-chapter paper 1 on biodiversity hotspots. So thank you, Shobha, for being with us in this discussion. And could you complement what Michelle was saying, and specifically about the downscale climate information? I think that's key for all these reports and for the action we have to take. Thank you.
Thanks, Ishmael, and good morning, everyone. Yes, so the Caribbean and small islands in general, they have been facing a chronic problem with respect to data shortages. And I mean, there's a long list of the types of data that we need in order to, increase our ability to understand the impacts of climate change. But key amongst those is a very, very chronic shortage or paucity of adequately downscale climate model data for small islands. So basically what happens is that with respect to all of the IPCCs and all of the climate studies around the world, they're pretty much, when you trace them back, they're based on projections that are developed by climate models across the world. Usually the climate models are spatial data, but these data are very, very large. So they consist of grid squares across the world. And these grid squares are huge. They are like about, say, squares of about 200 to 300 kilometers on each side. So if you have a small island, that sort of like disappears into these squares, and they're usually like just recognized as water instead of land. So there has been a need to basically downscale this data in order to fit the size and the variation at the small island scale. And this, unfortunately, has not kept up with the pace of the science. So what is happening is that we in the Caribbean, as well as other small islands across the world, we don't have up-to-date data in terms of the climate models. So without this, we can't. So if you don't have the data, you can't develop projections in terms of what might happen in the future. And if you can't develop the projections, then you can't develop the models. And without the models, you simply cannot develop robust adaptation strategies for small islands across several sectors, not just one or two. And without robust adaptation strategies, therefore, this directly limits the resilience potential of small islands going into the future. So it is indeed a very serious and problematic issue, and it is simply just something that it's sort of like trying to feel your way around a dark room. You're not really, because we're so small, without the details at our level, we can't just make generalizations. Small islands across the world they're kind of like, I always say that they're kind of like snowflakes. Each island is absolutely different, so you can't generalize and say, okay, according to the models, small islands will experience X increase in temperature by such and such date. Each island is different and unique, and therefore these data are really critical to being, to enable islands to basically move forward. Apart from the climate model data, there's also some other very key examples is that there's a shortage of future sea level data on future sea level, as well as wave projections. And I mean, taking into consideration that we're small islands and everybody is talking about sea level rise and that sort of stuff, the fact that we don't have adequate up-to-date sea level data or in terms of future sea level projections and wave projections is something that is extremely concerning, seeing that a lot of our damages and losses are based on events related to sea level rise and waves and the damage that they do. There is also this lack of data, this lack of climate model data also directly impacts livelihoods, in the sense that what research is showing globally is that as the climate is warming, species are moving away from the equator towards the poles. So they're trying to track cooler environments. And so within the Caribbean and within the tropics basically, we are seeing already, and we expect that species that can move will migrate northwards towards the temperate oceans. And because we need to understand, what does this mean for example, for our fishery stocks? Caribbean governments are really into the whole blue economy issues, but we don't have the information to basically tell us how, which fishery stocks might migrate, and therefore what we could probably replace them with, if anything at all. So these are many issues. There are many issues that basically tie into this lack of data and need to be addressed for us to move forward in a robust manner to increase our adaptation potential and our resilience potential to the effects of changing climate. And I think that is it in a nutshell, basically. I can hand over to you, Ishmael, for the other speaker at this point.
Thank you, Shoba, for your intervention and for speaking already of the need to strengthen the information that support the realities of our region in the Caribbean. And this will be a topic that will come along the whole discussion, I guess, because we need more information, more accurate information that let us plan accordingly to the situation. So there is already quite good information on sea level rise, which is a risk that affects all the world, but mostly small islands. And we want to invite Debbie Lay to come to the floor and speak about this topic. Debbie, thank you for being here with us. Debbie, she's a lead author of Chapter 18 of the report on climate resilient development pathways, She's also an economic affairs officer of Energy and Natural Resources at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you very much, Debbie, for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ismael and UNEP, for the invitation, the organization of the series of webinars. So I'm going to talk right now about sea level rise, and starting by mentioning that observations show that sea level rise is accelerating. In the East Caribbean, there's a greater than average sea level rise of 3 to 5 millimeters per year. And in West North Caribbean, it's greater also than average, from 2.5 to 3 millimeters per year. We're already seeing the impacts of accelerating sea level rise. Coastal cities are disproportionately affected, in part because of the exposure of multiple assets, economic activities, and large populations that are concentrated in narrow coastal zones. Early impacts of accelerated sea level rise have been detected at shelter and subsiding coasts, flooding at high tides, water table salinization, ecosystem and agricultural transitions, increased erosions, and coastal damage. And these changes are a major concern for small islands, given that a high percentage of their population, infrastructure, and economic assets are located in the low elevation coastal zone of below 10 meters elevation. And recent studies confirm that observed extreme sea level events causing extensive flooding generally resulted from compound effects, such as the combination of sea level rise with tropical depressions, the El Nino Southern Oscillation related high water levels associated with higher spring tide, and local human disturbances amplifying the impacts. The report finds that we are virtually certain that global mean sea levels will continue to rise through 2100. Now, in the medium to long term, we have different types of risks. We're talking about medium to long term, talks about up to 2100. So, some of the impacts, I'll start with coastal flooding and habitability. In the Caribbean, sea level rise is projected to exponentially increase flooding, with nearly every centimeter of sea level rise causing a doubling of the probability of flooding. Land area, home to 10% or more of the population of many SIDS, is at risk of chronic coastal flooding or permanent inundation by 2100. However, comparatively small changes in mean sea level can result in large increases in the frequency of events and the risk of coastal flooding of inhabited land. So this means that many areas of SIDS have become uninhabitable well before the time of permanent inundation. And this will cause increased migration, involuntary displacement, and planned resettlement, which may eventually lead to population movements from exposed areas and depopulation of some atoll islands and coastal areas of other types of islands. For freshwater and dependent ecosystems, the changes in sea level rise could cause salinity in estuarine and aquifer water, affecting ground and surface water resources for drinking and irrigation. And sea level rise undermines the long-term persistence of freshwater dependent ecosystems on islands, being one of the biggest threats to the goods and services these ecosystems provide. As far as coastal ecosystems can migrate landward or grow vertically in response to sea level rise, yet their resilience and capacity to keep up with sea level rise will be compromised by ocean warming and other drivers. And the effectiveness of conservation efforts and other adaptation options or responses is limited for the majority of world's reefs, with warming of 1.5 degrees C and above of global warming. For terrestrial biodiversity, sea level rise has been projected to impact the terrestrial biodiversity of low-lying islands and coastal regions via large habitat losses, both directly and indirectly. However, these impacts will vary depending on the island's topographical differences. So, for example, Caribbean islands were projected to suffer the most habitat loss, between 8.7% to 49.2% of its islands entirely submerged, respectively, from 1 meter to 6 meters of sea level rise. But many current projection studies consider marine flooding directly and seldom incorporate other indirect impacts, such as increased habitat losses from horizontal erosion loss, increased salinity levels, tidal ranges, and extreme events. And these projections are considered to be conservative, underestimating the extent of habitat loss to terrestrial biodiversity. So we could say that at centennial timescales, projected sea level rise represents an existential threat for island nations, low-lying coastal zones, and the community's infrastructure and cultural heritage therein. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for this presentation on the situation about sea level rise, which is really concerning, especially for small islands and in the Caribbean. So I want to remind to the audience before continuing that you can write your questions in the YouTube chat, since after this discussion with the lead authors of the IPCC report, we will have a questions and answer session with them, and this is a unique opportunity to make questions directly to the 3 lead authors of the report that are today with us. So thank you. I wanted to hand over to Shoba now, and wanted to ask you, Shoba, what about the impacts on biodiversity? Since you are also a specialist on biodiversity hotspots, could you tell us more about impacts and biodiversity and its consequences for island economies, livelihoods, etc.? If still maybe Shoba says, well, we can go to the next question maybe until Shoba is available again. And okay, so we can speak, well, we wanted to speak on the impacts on biodiversity first, but we can also go through this topic, loss and damage, which is not that new already, but it's really concerning as well. I mean, loss and damage. So until, well, I don't know if we have Shoba. She's not on the screen. Okay, yeah, here she is.
Great.
So let's go to the previous question.
So with respect to the biodiversity, okay.
Impacts on biodiversity.
Okay, sure. So
can you hear us?
I can hear. Can you hear me? I can hear you.
We can't see you so far.
But you can't hear me. Hello.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
So if until we fix this, she can read us and hear us.
So,
can you talk?
Can you hear me? I can hear and see everyone. Yes? Right. Okay, great. So I think everyone's seeing and hearing me. Okay, so with respect to biodiversity and climate change, it's been recently established and even supported even further by a recent, just before the WG2 report was released, a few months before, there was also a joint report between the IPCC and the IPBES on climate change and biodiversity, and it basically reiterated the well-known fact, at least among scientists, that you cannot adequately address climate change without addressing biodiversity and vice versa. They are both, there's a very strong interconnect between both of them, and this is a really important point to take forward. So just to give us some context, islands, well, including small islands, but islands across the world, if you think about the scale, so islands across the world, they occupy somewhere between 2 to 4% of the Earth's land surface. Yet they contain almost 1/5, almost 20% of all species, for example, on land that are found in the world. And that is really significant. And because, well, islands, one of the reasons for this is that islands have very high levels of endemic species, which are species that are found nowhere else in the world. But to add a bit more context, so apart from this high percentage, islands also, unfortunately, 80% of the historical extinctions that have happened on islands. So 80% of all extinctions in the world, as well as the fact that at present, almost 50% of all species considered to be threatened or under risk of extinction are also found on islands. So basically it's a very serious situation in the sense that islands are basically custodians of a very significant proportion of global biodiversity levels. So that's the context. The other thing is, that unlike some of the other impacts with respect to climate change, biodiversity at the moment has historically been very, very much impacted and hurt, and there's a lot of loss and damage towards biodiversity from human activity. So we're talking about things like deforestation, pollution, etc. And what is happening now is that the literature is showing that added to this, the loss and the damage that is being done to biodiversity by human activities, climate change is now coming into the mix. And with this added to the mix, it's exacerbating the already negative impacts that are being caused by human activities. At some point, it is expected, the projections show that climate change will actually take over or move forward as the major driver of biodiversity loss as it gets warmer. So, for example, I mentioned before, we have a lot of endemic species. Islands have a lot of endemic species, and these are species found nowhere else in the world. And a recent analyses show that at, for example, 3 degrees warming, 100% of island endemics are likely to face extinction. That would be a huge impact on global biodiversity levels. So, in terms of the ocean, I mean, Michelle already touched on coral reefs. Everybody, I think it's a very well-known topic that's been discussed, the loss of coral reefs. And maybe not so much, but there's also, like, in addition to coral reefs, there's also mangroves and seagrass beds, which are really, really important ecosystems and part of that biodiversity that are really critical to small islands. They provide the evidence is very clear that they provide a lot of critical services to islands and to the people that live on islands. For example, protection services, they buffer wave impact and wave erosion and that sort of stuff. So when it comes to like having to face hurricanes or storm surges, these are critical elements that really increase the resilience of islands that face such impacts. So biodiversity in all, and when we talk about biodiversity, we don't just mean species, we also mean ecosystems. Ecosystems are really critical to human survival on islands. They provide services which cannot be easily replaced, if at all. And so destruction of biodiversity and the ecosystems that they contain, that contain them, could seriously challenge the habitability of islands for human populations. They provide very important services such as like provisioning services, like in terms of providing food, water, etc. Regulating services like coastal protection or filtering of pollutants basically from the environment. There are also cultural services, for example. In general, I mean, ecosystems and biodiversity, they support human livelihoods, they support, and more importantly, they are critical to increasing our resilience as climate continues to change and as things continue to heat up and become drier, etc. So the issue is that, unfortunately, islands, small islands, we have limited space, and so as I mentioned before, as it gets warmer, generally what species do is they're trying to track the conditions that they're used to, right? So as it heats up and it gets warmer at the equator going upwards, you find species trying to move northwards or upwards, up from lowlands to mountains, in search of cooler conditions. So, I mean, if a species on a continent, for example, North America, finds that it's getting too warm, eventually it will move poleward because it has this land, and once it's able to migrate, it can actually move forward and try and survive. Whereas you don't find this on islands. Islands are basically locked by the ocean, so they simply can't move northwards to basically survive. They can move upwards, but there are problems in the sense that, you know, small islands with people, there's a lot of competition for natural habitat conservation as well as human activity. So if a species in the lowlands decides, okay, it's getting too hot, I need to move upwards, it might not even be able to do that, because to get from the lowlands to the mountains might not be possible because there's so much human activity disrupting that, basically. And even if they are able to make it up mountains, remember, mountains are they're conically shaped. So the further upwards you go, the less space you have. So eventually, even if species do make it to the mountains and they keep going upwards, at some point they will run out of space. So it's a very serious situation regarding biodiversity and small islands. And we really, like, in terms of, and this goes back to also the lack of the climate data that I mentioned before. The one thing that we know from past studies is that even under warming conditions, there are what we call climate refugia, which are areas, for example, cool valleys in mountains and that sort of stuff, which provide a safe haven for species as things heat up. But without the data, the downscale data, we can't really recognize where these might be, and therefore we can't create conservation plans, or, you know, we can't adjust our protected areas to suit. So this is also, it goes back to the data again. And I mean, some people would describe, to be quite honest, some people would describe the big picture of island biodiversity as somewhat of a wicked problem, which is that, you know, we can't really see any long-term solution if temperatures continue to rise. If temperatures are somehow stabilized to 1.5 or 2 degrees, then yes, I mean, there's a much better chance of survival. But if things heat up beyond that, it doesn't really look good in terms of the overall biodiversity survival for small islands. And that, in a nutshell, is it. The same thing happened, refers to the marine and the coastal biodiversity. What we are actually seeing, which is really interesting, is that the protected areas that occur along the coasts, they are actually heating up faster than the areas of ocean outside of the protected areas, because you tend to find coastal areas heating up faster. So it's kind of ironic. The species that are within these, a lot of the species that are within these marine protected areas, they are being exposed to more heat rather than less heat. And so will likely leave, if they can, the protected areas and migrate northwards. So it is expected that tropical waters, where you find a lot of small islands, will eventually become depauperized, and the ecosystems will suffer as well. Again, we need the data in order to be able to plan for this and to increase our resilience, because this will directly impact livelihoods such as fishing, tourism, and many other indirect impacts as well. Sorry to end on such a terrible note, but it really, unless there can be effective mitigation to keep temperatures in check, it doesn't really look very good for biodiversity within small islands. Ishmael, I can hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Shobha. Yes, there is not a positive scenario, and that's why we have to act now. Thank you for this information. Not not very positive, as I say, on biodiversity, on ecosystems, including biodiversity and the services they provide, with changes we are experiencing, the livelihoods that are at risk, and well, in general, nature is at risk. So we are also very clear that we are facing a triple planetary crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and we have to act with a unique approach for these three crises. So very important. Also, you mentioned again the importance to have accurate downscale data that let us know the reality, the future, and the consequences, and then act accordingly. So we want to continue. Well, we want to remind also to the audience that you can keep typing your questions. We already have several of those, very interesting for the Q&A session after the discussion. So we want to continue now with Debbie. Debbie, again, can you go deeper on the loss and damage issue to say something, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I'll start by saying that loss and damage has a range of conceptualizations and is a critical issue for many small islands. It's an issue also closely related to climate justice. The IPCC definition of losses and damages is harm from observed impacts and projected risks, and can be economic and or non-economic. And small islands are already experiencing an array of losses and damages, which are projected to increase as global average temperatures rise. Non-economic losses are also important in the region. There are unquantifiable and highly localized cultural losses resulting from climate drivers that are less researched and less acknowledged in policy than physical and economic losses. So for a few examples, in the Bahamas, prolonged displacement of the entire population of Ragged Island following Hurricane Irma in 2017 highlighted the cultural losses that can result from climate-induced displacement from ancestral homelands. Threats to identity, sense of place, and community cohesion resulted from displacement, although our important foundational features of the islanders' self-initiated rehabilitation efforts and eventual return. Nonetheless, non-economic losses were not accounted for by policy addressing displacement. In the case of Monkey River Village in Belize, coastal erosion is threatening the community's cemetery. Residents place significant spiritual and emotional value on the cemetery, which serves important community functions, and thus threats to it are perceived to be serious and necessary to be taken into account in any planned response. A similar situation exists in Carriacou in the West Indies, where culturally and historically significant archaeological sites are being lost due to coastal erosion caused by a combination of sand mining and extreme climate ocean events exacerbated by sea level rise. For SIDS in particular, loss and damage has negative implications for sustainable development. Loss and damage can lead to an unvirtuous cycle of climate-induced erosion of development and resilience. Whereas in this cycle, addressing loss and damage strains limited national resources, diverting public funding and other resources to address negative climate impacts. This in turn reduces resources and capacities which could be allocated to adaptation, building resilience, and sustainable development, thereby increasing vulnerability to climate change and leading to further loss and damage where the cycle begins again. So the cascading and cumulative impacts of extreme events experienced in Caribbean SIDS exemplify that this cycle may already be in effect. In addition to the strain on national resources that loss and damage currently presents, credit ratings of SIDS have recently begun to include vulnerability to climate change, which may have negative impacts on their abilities to borrow external funds, attract foreign investment, or access concessional funding. In the international policy arena, small islands, as part of the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, have been strong advocates for including loss and damage in the United Frameworks Convention on Climate Change, highlighting the increasing and irreversible risks that climate change poses for islands in particular. IOSIS, along with other developing countries and groups, have advocated that there is pressing need for finance and resources to address loss and damage, as well as greater integration of loss and damage in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, including in capacity building, technology, and the global stocktake. So methods and mechanisms to assess climate-induced losses and damages remain largely undeveloped for small islands, posing one of the gaps that we currently have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. In fact, this is already a solution for loss and damage is already a medium-term trajectory claim from small islands. So, I mean, we have to take it seriously and find a solution. And we want to go for a more positive scenario. Shoba, which are the opportunities for nature resolution and ecosystem-based adaptation? There are opportunities, right?
Okay, so with respect to what we refer to usually as ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions, there are quite a few, but also there are limitations again. So when we refer to an ecosystem-based adaptation strategy or nature-based solution, it usually comes with the stipulation that there must be benefits to both ecosystems as well as human communities. So you can't just have it. It's not just for one or the other, basically. And again, because small islands are limited by space, this is our major limiting factor. What we find in reality is that there's a lot of competition between the need to conserve natural habitat, natural vegetation, etc., and to also allow for human developmental needs, such as the establishment of settlements, infrastructure, etc. And so, I mean, this is a problem worldwide. But because if you take it to a small island scale, it's the whole situation becomes more intense because of the limited amount of space that you have to work with. And so basically, this sort of also limits the potential in terms of what can be done with respect to adaptation strategies. Ideally, what we need would be climate smart strategies that are locally driven, because adaptation is very locally context specific, locally driven, flexible, sustainable solutions that also ideally would include local communities. The literature is very clear. If you include and you empower local communities to within these strategies, they are much more successful in the long run. And so when it comes to islands with all of these limitations, one of the things that we are also seeing is that when it comes to the national adaptation plans, there's a lot more focus in terms of marine and coastal adaptation compared to, say, the inclusion of, say, terrestrial aspects within the national adaptation plans. But in reality, I mean, it's very easy to do this, to include this, because there's a lot of ongoing stuff that's happening that's just not really referred to as adaptation. So, for example, integrated watershed management, disaster risk and reduction activities, reforestation, and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of reforestation as well going on. So all of these things can be included. It's just that for whatever reason they haven't as yet, but hopefully this will change soon. And so one strategy in particular that seems to be making a lot of headway in terms of being effective is what we call a ridge to reef strategy, where you build interconnections across or among different ecosystems. So starting from the ridge, the top of the mountain, going straight down to the reef, the coral reef, amongst the terrestrial, the freshwater, the coastal, and then of course the marine environments. Studies are actually showing that, for example, if you were to pair or couple protected areas. So for example, you have a marine protected area at the bottom with your coral reefs, and you were to protect a protected area on land right above that coral reef. The health of that coral reef and the survival and the resilience of that coral reef is much more improved, because you don't have all of the erosion and the pollution and whatever coming from upland feeding into the coral reef. So one of the things that we can build on is the fact that everywhere, but especially on islands, everything is so deeply and closely interconnected. What you do to one ecosystem will definitely impact on the other. And so instead of seeing this as a problem, this can be seen as a strength, in the sense that if we merge our protection, one of the issues is that we have silos. You tend to have a lot of people thinking, okay, I'm a terrestrial protected area planner, so I just need to focus on that. And you have people with the MPAs, the marine protected areas, thinking the same. The silos are a big problem. And if we were to move forward from that towards merging and, creating a more holistic unit of conservation, this would really work in our favor, and it would definitely build our resilience potential towards the future as climate continues to change. The other issue that I need to mention before I end is that because of this, and this is also very important, this merging and this more holistic approach is more important because we don't have the luxury that, say, protected areas would have on the continents. Usually what they say is, okay, well, it's getting warm, let's just expand the protected areas northwards, and this will facilitate the species as they move. The fact is, as I mentioned before, we can't do that. We don't have the land, we don't have the space to necessarily increase our protected areas very much, or to add corridors, etc. But what we can do is integrate, so interconnect our conservation amongst the ecosystems, and also try as much as possible, which is also being shown to be very successful in literature, try to, apart from the protected areas, also try to develop ways to include protection of non-protected areas. So for example, buffers around protected areas, or maybe trying to, work with private stakeholders or private landowners, for example, to give them incentives to not cut down their forests, and to, trying to create as much of a natural network across the islands as possible. The greater the contiguity of natural cover on the islands, the more resilient we will be to, and our ecosystems will be to changing climate conditions. So that is it, basically, as a synopsis. Over to you, Ishmael.
Thank you so much very much. We, the ones that work with nature resolutions, are working always in positive. We think there are opportunities. We think there are very good options with nature, and every time more and more people are joining this idea, and it's very important to work with nature, not against nature. And however, there are limits to adaptation that are already there. We know them. We know some of them. We have more information on these limits. Debbie, can you tell us more about the limits to adaptation?
Sure, thank you. So I'll start with the definition of limits, and a limit is defined as a point at which an actor's objectives or system's needs cannot be secured from intolerable risk through adaptive actions. So limits are categorized as being soft or hard. Soft limits may change over time as additional adaptation options that are that are practical or affordable become available. And hard limits will not change over time as no additional adaptive actions are possible. And this is, for example, with the loss of coral reefs or with the extinction of a species. You know, there aren't adaptation actions that can reverse that. So soft limits are already being experienced in the Caribbean. Soft limits to adaptation for coastal flooding and erosion are already being experienced in some islands, largely due to financial, physical, and technological constraints. While seawalls have been erected to minimize coastal erosion, these defenses need regular upgrading, replacement as high swells, tropical cyclones, and constant wave action erode their effectiveness. And the high cost of installing, upgrading, and enlarging such infrastructure has led seawalls only being used in specific locations, leaving communities that are beyond the extent of these measures exposed to inundation and erosion. So across SIDS, adaptation to coastal flooding and erosion in particular, is
I think there might be some connection issue with Debbie. So we can, well, we were speaking about limits of and hard limits to adaptation. I think she already gave a good overview on where we are regarding limits and how we have to plan regarding these limits, and adaptation is already being an option, but for some opportunities we don't have. I mean, we have less options. So let's move to the final thoughts and conclusions from Michelle before going to the questions and answers. Michelle, we've been speaking about risks, we've been speaking about impacts, we've been speaking about opportunities, limits, loss and damage. What are your conclusions and what are the key messages that we can give to the audience and to policymakers, to stakeholders, etc.? Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Ishmael. In fact, I am an adaptation specialist, so I can continue from what Debbie just said, and I can wind it up. I think the audience that we have today would be very much interested in finding out, given all the impacts and the risks and the vulnerabilities, what are some of the adaptation options that are available? So yes, in the Caribbean, we have seen where we have had ecosystem-based adaptation, but we have also used protective measures such as engineering measures such as seawalls. What we have found from the scientific literature, though, is that if you do not design these seawalls appropriately, they can actually cause more damage than we anticipate. What is also necessary, as Debbie says, is that we have to continuously improve our design of seawalls, monitor how well they're working, and ensure that they are well maintained. And these things cost. In terms, they have an economic cost. The other factor is we have been using coastal setbacks in terms of getting buildings to push back from the coastline. So any new land use zoning plans will in fact show coastal setbacks so that we are not putting people in the zone of risk to storm surges, etc. And in the worst case scenario, what we try to do is to look at ways in which particularly very, very vulnerable populations, informal settlements and so on, how we can maybe ask them to retreat from the coastline and be involved in selective relocation. Of course, that is always socially disruptive. And so we have to address how we proceed. It's a last resort. Relocation is an absolute last resort for us in the Caribbean, especially because of the limited land space, as Shova has already very well highlighted. So at that, At this point, at this juncture, what I will do is give my key conclusions that have emanated actually from the report. I think we are speaking to an audience of policymakers, a research community. We are speaking to people on this call who are from the NGO community. And the question is, what are some of the conclusions that are relevant to them as actors in the pursuit of the urgent action needed to address the challenges we are facing from climate change in the Caribbean? It is quite clear in terms of conclusions that small islands face an existential threat if global warming continues to rise above the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And when we say existential threat, we talk about our people, our economies, our economic assets, our ecosystems, our culture and heritage. What is equally important for us is the scientific community is aware and obviously will recognize that there are gaps. We found it in doing our assessment. We need more up-to-date baseline data and access to climate information to be able to be prepared and to adapt to all the climate change impacts and also the extreme events that can pose challenges for us. And these would include, obviously, the hurricanes we experience everywhere. And I know that CIMH in the Caribbean, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, is ramping up its game in terms of data collection for that very purpose. As you know, as we've said before, our coastal ecosystems are highly sensitive and our economies are coastally focused on tourism. We have sensitive ecosystems such as the fisheries sector, which will be impacted by the warming of the ocean. And so the question is, what are alternatives? What can we do? We may have to consider aquaculture as an option. There is the issue of looking at how we can improve more, experiment with more drought-resistant crops. How can we get our crops to adapt to flood conditions? There are new technologies out there, and we will need the climate information to do these things. For many of the policymakers involved in land use planning, we've involved in looking at the revision of building codes. I think this is an opportunity for us, a moment for reflection on how we are actually working. Are we working in silos, or are we harmonizing our approaches for adaptation of our cities and settlements? So land use planning, revised building codes, engineering solutions, the use of green infrastructure, and how we can be more innovative is an area that we need to do more research on. And Shobha has already said we do need more detailed databases for the bathymetry, coastal assets, and so on. And I should end by saying, in terms of the adaptation measures, protection, accommodation, and retreat, while we know that they're being used in the Caribbean, we do need more feasibility studies to determine how effective those adaptation measures are in responding to sea level rise and flooding. The scale of needed action remains limited, and it requires far more research from what we are seeing. Certainly, there are several things we can do: governance reform, institutional reform, legal reforms. We need improved access to adaptation finance. I'm sure that's the gorilla in the room for many of us. We need to look at indigenous knowledge, community knowledge, education, and awareness building programs to assist us in the best way possible to meet the challenges that we face. In closing, what I would say is our report is very clear. We face an existential threat, and urgent action is needed on multiple fronts, and some of it can be done locally, and at the other level, some of that would have to involve us being more vocal in the international fora in getting the global community to recognize what is happening to us in small islands, and how drastic action is needed to reduce the emission of the greenhouse gases that are causing the global warming. On that note, Ishmael, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We're going to go to the Q&A session now. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions. If we are briefly responding to them, we might start with a very direct one of Bianca Young. You think climate change action in the Caribbean has been adequate and effective over the past 7 years, or over the past few years at least? Who want to take on this question, climate change action?
Perhaps, Ishmael, I can start, and my other colleagues, Debbie and Shobha, can join me after. What I would say is the time frame of 7, we are talking about after the AR5 report, I suppose. What has happened since AR5? That's a very short time in terms of a period in which we can monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of climate action. In fact, that's the very point I was making in winding up when I said that we do need feasibility studies to help us determine how effective the measures have been. Watershed management, to be able to assess how well it's working, we do need time to see if it is actually assisting us in water conservation and in addressing issues of water scarcity. Yes, there are many projects funded internationally and are being implemented in the region, but each island is very specific in terms of its own context, and we would need to gather that data to do the feasibility studies. That's why I'm saying the research gap is there, and that we do need to ensure that we are able to effectively evaluate the scientific data on it.
Yeah, thank you. Shobha might want to complement the response. Shobha, you want to go further on this question? Otherwise, we can go to the next one. Just to complement a little bit, is that we people that work on adaptation have several barriers, right? One of those is finance, and we try not to rely only on international financing, but also on local sources that are there or might be there, and then build on financial mechanisms and tools that let us close this gap on adaptation that Michelle was mentioning. And then we can go to another question. We were speaking about data, climate data, and several funds like a Green Climate Fund ask for 30 years of climate data for presenting a proposal. Where can we find, I mean, this is a tricky question, but where can we find reliable, accurate climate data for the Caribbean and for every island? I mean, who want to reply to this question? I mean, there is no single answer for this, but maybe. So I want to reply.
Okay, yeah. So that's a really good question, and I think alluding to what Ishmael just said, as far as I know, there is no place that we can actually find adequately downscaled, up-to-date climate model data for the Caribbean. The issue is that there's a lag time between the suite of climate models that are being used. So before, it's like, I think maybe AR4, AR5, somewhere there, they use the stress scenarios, and that has been replaced by the RCP scenarios. As far as I know, we have absolutely no RCP scenarios that have been downscaled for the Caribbean to an adequate scale. And this is really at the core of the problem. and pretty much was based on what I was saying. I mean, I know that there's a need for this data, but somehow or the other, the data is not there yet. It's not. My communication with the modeling community has basically indicated that they have not yet. It's not yet available. They're still waiting, and the problem is it takes time, right? When the modeling communities get these data, these large-scale data from the international modeling groups, they need time and resources to downscale this to a degree that we can use, and this takes a lot of resources, time-wise, computing-wise, etc. And so it's always a catch-up game. And so, I mean, they have SRES, but that's outdated. So, but that's the best that they have as far as I know. And this is unfortunately the chronic problem that has been perpetuated since I think the whole IPCC cycle started in the first place. How many reports ago?
Thank you, Shoam. So I think we can move to another question. There were several questions regarding risks, climatic risks. Which are, in your opinion, the most important risk for tourism industry, for private sector operating in the water sector, and also in general for cities that close to the sea and or coastal cities? So I mean, these are three separated questions, but I give you the floor to respond to each of them. Who wants to start? Most important risks for private sector operating in water, for tourism, and for coastal cities.
Ishmael, I can start by saying certainly in the Caribbean, a lot of investment has been made in terms of coastal tourism, and the private sector has in fact invested heavily in that. The risks that sector faces obviously would be the hurricanes that are experienced in the region annually. That event causes a number of risks in terms of damage to infrastructure and buildings and so on. Of course, there's the associated flooding, and I think flooding may in fact be more common in the Caribbean region, affecting multiple sectors, not just tourism, but agriculture, and obviously impacting on our coastal settlements, where most of our infrastructure, people, and economic assets are concentrated. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. You want Shoba to respond as well?
No, I'm pretty much going to defer to Michelle here. She pretty much covered it. I mean, the question didn't really refer to biodiversity, but I can say one thing about that is, which is generally the whole biodiversity sector has a problem with funding, in the sense that funding is not as well allocated towards this sector compared to some of the others, and understandably so to some extent. But yeah, that's my 2 cents basically.
Thank you. I think Debbie wanted also to add something. I'm not sure we have her. Oh, she's having some issues. Okay, so well, it's already 11:25. I think well, there's a last question. We might go for that very concrete. We talked about the link between tropical depressions and sea level rise. Is there a similar link expected between sea level rise and hurricanes in the Caribbean?
Could you repeat the last point, Ishmael?
Sure. Is there a similar link expected between sea level rise and hurricanes in the Caribbean as the link that was talked about between tropical depressions and sea level rise?
I'm not getting the last part clearly.
Hurricanes.
Yeah.
Hurricanes in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Sea level rise and hurricanes.
No, well, sea level rise is coming due to the global warming and the melting of the glaciers. And that's really a slow onset event, whereas the hurricanes are rapid onset events. And the hurricanes are coming partly because of the warming of the oceans, yes, and the building up of that coming from the coast of Africa into the Caribbean. But I wouldn't say it's because of sea level rise we get hurricanes, but it's because of the warming of the ocean. And because of the constant warming up with higher temperatures, now we're seeing the category 4 and 5 magnitude hurricanes that are posing tremendous destruction to Caribbean economies on an annual basis now. And, you know, the economic loss is in the region of sometimes 200% of their gross national product. So you can't even recover from one year to the next, basically.
Can I also add? So there, in terms of the projections, though, there is it's sort of like an accepted fact that as sea level rise continues to happen, the impacts of hurricanes via storm surges will become more intense. So you have higher sea level rises and you have more intense hurricanes. Basically, what happens is that when a hurricane does happen and the storm surges happen, they're more intense, more destructive. And this is obviously to the detriment of small islands and the coastal regions as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are close to the end of the webinar. I want to thank you, the three lead authors that were with us, all the audience. I don't know if somebody wants to do like a last minute, 1 minute intervention, somebody that had something to say that didn't say so far. Otherwise,
I can 1 minute. I think we can each 1 minute do a quick summary. I think certainly the people on the call, the policymakers, researchers, the NGO community, would need to study the report to determine where they can be called into action to play an instrumental role in helping us implement projects and cope with the adaptation. I think adaptation finance is a big issue for us. And yes, we can look at local or domestic resource mobilization. And there is funding available through the diaspora that we can tap into. But the magnitude of the response will require a global commitment as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think that was a very good closing for our webinar. So I really thank you to Michelle, Mikko, to Soga Maharaj, and to David Lay, three lead authors of this last report of the IPCC. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you also to Adele Thomas, who couldn't join us in the end. And thank you to Vincent Sweeney and the Sub-Regional Office of UNEP in the Caribbean. Thank you to the Climate Change Unit of UNEP and the Science Sub-Program. And thank you, of course, to all the audience. We remind you that this webinar will be in YouTube, so you can come back and see it again as many times as you want. So we just to remind you that there will be a fourth webinar next Friday on this climate resilient development pathways that are in this last report of the IPCC and all the paths that we need to take from now as we have to take urgent action. So thank you very much to everybody and have a great day.